honor to introduce our next segment, our view from the House, a look at the critical metals issue featuring two U.S. congressmen who have made the rare earths and the critical metals more generally a policy priority at a time when, I'll go for a lunch metaphor here, the congressional plate is more than full. Congressman Doug Lamborn has represented Colorado's 5th District since his election in 2006. He's the chairman of the House Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources, and of direct relevance to the issues we're examining at this conference, he sits on the House Armed Services Committee. Congressman Lamborn is author of H.R. 2011, the National Strategic and Critical Minerals Policy Act. It aims at expanding our understanding of our mineral needs and identifying the barriers that prevent us from meeting those needs with metals and minerals mined here in the United States. The bill is framed around the question Congressman Lamborn asked at its introduction, and I quote, "With vast amounts of minerals in the United States, why are we relying on foreign countries for our domestic supply?" Our second congressional speaker also comes from Colorado. First elected in 2008, Congressman Mike Coffman represents Colorado's 6th District. He too sits on the House Armed Services Committee. As a veteran of both United States operations in Iraq, Operation Desert Storm, and Operation Iraqi Freedom. Congressman Coffman is author of H.R. 1388, the Restart Act, the Rare Earth Supply Chain Technology and Resource Transformation Act, which would expedite a permitting process that ranks the U.S. worst in the world among mining companies, taking an average of 7 to 10 years to bring new mines into production. Restart would also direct the DLA, the Defense Logistic Agency, to create a rare earths inventory. The ground rules, Congressman, are that there really are no ground rules. Just an open mic discussion, an open mic and open Doug discussion, I guess, on how the House sees critical metal matters, what role national security plays in this debate, what Congress can do through the legislative process to advance the domestic development of critical resources, and all this at a time when we're told to be on the lookout for shovel-ready jobs. So how soon can you get it done? We'll start with Congressman Lamborn.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for those who organized this event. It's an honor to be with Senator Murkowski, who's a leader in opening up the mineral and energy resources of this whole country, as well as the great state of Alaska. And it's an honor to be here with my Colorado colleague, Senator Coffman, who has done a great work on emphasizing rare earth minerals in particular, among other things. Well, thank you for letting me speak here about how Congress can help the nation's growing problem of accessing strategic and critical minerals. My interest in this subject, as was mentioned a moment ago, stems from my work on the House Natural Resources Committee as well as the House Armed Services Committee. Some of these minerals we are talking about here today are critical to our national defense. In the past, we've relied on foreign suppliers for these minerals, but it is never wise to depend on someone else for something you can do on your own. The United States has many of the mineral resources required to meet our defense needs. We just need to have a better inventory of what we have, where they are located, and the ability to access them. The chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, Doc Hastings of Washington, and I have introduced legislation to do just that. It's a common sense solution that will provide for our common defense, bring in revenues to our treasury, and provide for private sector job creation. According to the National Research Council, one of the primary advantages the United States possesses over our strongest industrial competitors is our domestic resource base. In other words, we have a lot of mineral resources that could be developed. The United States is among the world's largest producer of many important metals and minerals, particularly copper, gold, lead, molybdenum, silver, and zinc. Now, when I refer to strategic and critical minerals, this includes rare earth metals, but does go beyond them. Yet, domestic mineral exploration has stagnated or declined during most of the 1990s and 2000s, even though global mineral exploration trends were strongly positive. You know, we had a hearing recently, and when they describe how it takes 8 to 10 years to open a mine in the United States, but as little as 2 years in Australia or Canada, it's no surprise that that's where resources are going. In 1993, we attracted 20% of the worldwide minerals exploration budget. Today, that's about 8%. Without increased domestic exploration, significant declines in U.S. mineral production are unavoidable as we exhaust current reserves. We will continue to ship jobs overseas and forfeit our economic competitiveness unless we take steps to develop our own mineral resources. This lack of exploration expenditures and other factors has made us more dependent on foreign imports. And the senator from Alaska was talking about this. For example, 25 years ago, the United States was dependent on foreign sources for 30 non-fuel mineral materials, 6 of which were entirely imported, and another 16 which were imported to the tune of more than 60% of what we needed. But last year, our import dependence for non-fuel mineral resources has doubled from 30 to 67, more than doubled. 18 commodities were imported entirely, as opposed to 6, to meet the nation's requirements. And another 25, instead of 16, required imports of more than, in this case, 50%. Much of the focus has understandably been on rare earth elements because of China's restrictions on imports. And they currently produce about 96% of the world's rare earth elements. But these are not the only ones that should be of concern to us, as important as that concern is. For example, at a 2006 subcommittee hearing on the energy and mineral requirements for renewable and alternative fuels used for transportation and other purposes, Robin Storer stated that by 2016, less than half of the world demand for copper mine supply can be met from production from existing mines, and that the world needs the equivalent of 30 new major mines by 2016 to meet the projected growth in demand. The worldwide economic downturn in 2008 and 9 and slow recovery has delayed that dire projection, but has not eliminated it. The United States has abundant copper resources and could benefit greatly from development of projects like Resolution Copper in Arizona. Developing our nation's mineral resources is not only an integral part of an all-of-the-above energy plan, but will create long-term family wage jobs, stimulate our economy, and reduce our foreign dependence on mineral resources. Just last week, the House of Representatives passed legislation providing for a land change in order for Resolution Copper to be developed. The United States needs more projects like that, as well as Mountain Pass, Bear Lodge, and Boken Mountain rare earth projects to be developed and mined. Today, the United States relies on foreign countries like China for half our non-fuel mineral materials and is entirely dependent on foreign sources for all rare earth metals. 2 years ago, China began intentionally reducing their exports of rare earth metals and eventually cut off exports to Japan after a dispute. And by not accessing our vast mineral supply, we're losing out on high-paying American jobs. The United States mining industry currently supports over 700,000 jobs nationwide, and this industry is fundamental to a healthy economy and strong manufacturing sector. There's no doubt about the development of our abundant natural resources that it would have an immediate positive impact on job creation and economic development. The bill that Chairman Hastings and I introduced earlier this year that I mentioned, H.R. 2011, the National Strategic and Critical Minerals Policy Act of 2011, would promote domestic production of minerals vital to our economy. Our bill has 35 co-sponsors and was reported out of committee on July 20th by unanimous consent. And I'd love to see the Speaker bring the bill to the House floor for passage sometime after the first of the year. And let me just briefly lay out the key elements of this legislation. It requires the Secretary of the Interior to coordinate a government-wide inventory of the nation's non-fuel mineral resources on federal lands and to identify restrictions that would hinder this development. It requires the Secretary of Interior to evaluate factors that are impacting domestic mineral material, including workforce access permitting and duplicative regulatory requirements. It directs the Interior Department to assemble a report within 6 months and require them to include a specific inventory of rare earth element potential on federal lands and identify impediments to that production. And it requires an annual report outlining the progress made in reaching the policy goals described in the bill. It provides guidance to the United States Geological Survey on what mineral commodities they should focus on for their planned national mineral assessment. The USGS is currently developing models to be used in the National Mineral Assessment scheduled to begin in fiscal year 2013. And it directs the USGS to expand their global mineral assessment to include rare earth elements and other minerals that are critical based on the impact of a potential supply restriction. Other legislative efforts that are pending in the House include H.R. 1540, the National Defense Authorization Act, which has to do with minerals critical to our national defense. H.R. 2090, the Energy Critical Elements Advancement Act of 2011. H.R. 1388, Representative Coffman's bill that was mentioned earlier, and I think we'll hear more about. Expect other pieces of legislation as well, dealing with domestic mineral policy issues, to be introduced throughout this session of Congress. The challenge will be in bringing the House and Senate together to agree on legislation addressing domestic minerals that will be signed into law by the President. I am hopeful we can find bipartisan support for these efforts. We recently had bipartisan consensus in both the House and the Senate and the White House for 3 free trade agreements, and we should do so as well when it comes to our strategic and critical minerals. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you so much for having us here today. You know, when I was elected and sworn in January 2009, I can remember I served on the Armed Services Committee, and reading about a 9-column story in one of those defense periodicals that talked about these rare earth metals, and it's the first time I'd ever heard about them, and it talked about how they were critical to so many of our weapon systems in DoD, and that there was a reliance on China for these. And so as I began to look into the issue, I found that reliance was around 95 to 97% on China. That they had, in fact, undermined the world market to acquire this near monopoly status. And then in looking at it further, that China's industrial policies, China's state-driven industrial policy, in effect, is a mercantile theory, along the lines of a mercantile theory, where they don't want to be exporting raw materials; they want to be exporting finished manufactured products. And so this state-run industrial policy is really centered around that, and rare earth metals are a critical element of that strategy. And so as they've expanded their industrial base at the expense of ours and much of the rest of the industrialized world, they've made sure that there is a ready supply of these of rare earth metals to first supply their own industrial base, and what is left over is for the rest of the industrialized world. And so we know that they've restricted, they have a policy of restricting exports and driving down the quantity of exports and driving up the price of those exports. But what really concerns me is that China is not a reliable trading ally with the United States. That China has utilized rare earth metals as leverage to achieve other objectives. And I think, case in point, Japan. That when Japan, I think, had a territorial dispute with China, that China basically suspended shipments to Japan, an industrial manufacturing power, for a limited period of time, greatly affecting it. And we know to the extent that rare earth metals are used in advanced technologies, from cell phones to computers to renewable energies, solar power, wind power, to a lot of our weapon systems. And so that really drove me to a concern about our reliance on China, and what can we do to break that? What can we do to reestablish a competitive supply chain, a domestic competitive supply chain in the United States for rare earth metals? And it was interesting that first, when I worked with the Department of Defense, that they were literally in denial that there was a problem at all. and they would say, well, it's not a problem because we can cut in front of we under current law we can cut in front of the line. So not concerned about our economic security as a country, but we can cut in front of the lines, and we are certain by our ability to do that we can meet our requirements for rare earth metals in terms of defense contracting. And I think now they've finally backed away from that, and that they've acknowledged, yes, there is an issue in working with them. And so and there's a GAO report that is due to come out soon that I think that will reflect that. And I think that that's very important. And so, I mean, when you think about where we are right now, to some extent, I want to say, when we look at government intervention on this issue, we have to ask ourselves, what is a market capable of doing without government? And I think that there has been a response, not just in the United States, but internationally. We now have one mine opening up in Mountain Pass, California, the Mountain Pass mine, that's fairly significant, but I certainly hope that we have more. Many other industrialized countries are looking at what they can do to not be reliant upon China. And so I think we see economic forces reacting to the situation that we're in, understanding that China is not a reliable trading partner. And one thing that I've done is try to work with our trade representative to the World Trade Organization, Ron Kirk, and to file a complaint against China on the rare earth metals. And it's interesting, I took a trip, I was in China, I believe it was late last spring, and met with Chinese leadership and put the question forward about rare earth metals. And it was interesting, their answer, and I didn't quite get it then, as I was pretty slick until I got back. And their response is, well, we really have strong environmental concerns about rare earth metals and the mining and processing of these things. And so I said, okay, that was their response. So when I got back, I said, the one loophole in WTO is an environmental issue in terms of in terms of trade, in terms of restricted trade practices. But I think we've got to remember that these policies are not driven by the free market system in terms of China and how they see rare earth metals. They're really derived from a state run policy that doesn't allow these metals, these important metals, to flow in accordance to price on the international market, but again, on what China will allow to be exported. And I think from a defense point of view, as a member of the Armed Services Committee, the fact that it's beyond the fact that China isn't a reliable trading partner. It's that China sees themselves as a competitor to the United States. And that in doing so, they in fact, again, through a decision of the Chinese government, disrupt the flow of rare earth metals to the United States for political purposes or for military purposes. And so in that, we cannot leave the United States vulnerable to Chinese policy, whether it be the national security interest of the United States or whether it be the economic security of the United States. Whether you look at it from either one of these angles, one understands clearly that the United States has to take proactive action in terms of addressing these issues. So I reintroduced the Rare Earth Supply Chain Technology and Resource Transformation Act, or Restart Act, last April. The act takes a whole of government approach and would initiate a number of key activities, including expediting the permitting process without waiving environmental concerns, setting up a rare earth inventory to source domestic needs, and requiring the various cabinet secretaries to appoint executive agents for rare earths in order to work together to try to see what we can do to, again, get a competitive domestic supply chain going of rare earth metals. Right now I'm working on this issue from 3 separate fronts, through the House Armed Services Committee, through the Natural Resources Committee with my friend Congressman Lamborn, and again through the United States Trade Representative that I mentioned earlier. So during the 2012 Defense Authorization Act, I included 2 provisions on rare earth metals. The first, a provision requiring the Secretary of Defense to report back to Congress on the feasibility and desirability of recycling, recovering, and reprocessing rare earth elements, including fluorescent lighting in the Department of Defense facilities, neodymium iron boron magnets used in weapon systems, and commercial off-the-shelf items such as computer hard drives. The second provisions is a requirement for the Defense Logistics Agency Strategic Minerals, formerly known as the Defense National Stockpile Center, to develop a plan to establish an inventory, not a stockpile, of rare earth oxides, metals, alloys, and magnets for defense purposes. They must identify the steps necessary to develop or maintain a competitive multi-source supply chain to avoid reliance on a single source of supply. Such a plan would mitigate our nation's current overdependence on China. It would also encourage U.S. manufacturing capabilities and thus reinvigorate a competitive multi-source domestic rare earth industry. It will then be up to the Secretary of Defense to determine whether to execute the plan based on need. Regarding the possible inventory, we are awaiting the Pentagon's Office of Industrial Policy report on the rare earth supply chain, now expected on December 1st. I've suggested they consider, obviously, my rare earth inventory plan. And with that, I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
And I think we have a question over here. We could start with that while he comes up to moderate.
You know, the question was, why not a reliance on the free market system?
Well, I would say the issue is that we've relied on the free market.
Oh, that it hasn't worked.
Well, profit motive versus national security.
Okay. Well, I think the problem is the fact that China has through, again, a state-run policy, has prevented the free market system from working. I mean, if China were allowed to, well, I don't know if China would be in the position that they're in today if they allowed the free market system to work. I mean, it is, again, through a state-run industrial policy that has allowed them to have near monopoly status on these critical metals. But I think more importantly, it would not be an issue to me if in fact China was a reliable trading partner, if in fact China allowed the free market, allowed free trade to work on this particular area. But look at what they've done. They've limited exports, placed tariffs on those exports. I mean, their policy is around making sure that their own industrial base is sourced first. And again, in addition to that, using it as leverage for unrelated issues such as what I mentioned in Japan. So I think the problem is not about the profit motive. The problem is China has played by the rules when it comes to international trade and free markets.
Go on this side, Dan, Cordy, I think I had a question, then we'll come back. Yeah.
When the term comes up in all of these bits of proposed legislation terms, critical material, determining critical materials, conducting assessments, resource assessments, and determining an inventory of the natural resources and manufacturing stockpile potential in the United States. That is 3 big potatoes that really fills the plate for the people that are in the know from the USGS, from the stockpile, from policy and materials in the Department of Defense, and from the Department of Commerce. It's a vast undertaking to about this. In China, where you have state planning and basically command-oriented economics, that's not a problem. But in the United States, it's going to require a mechanism between a big, mechanism of cooperation between the private sector and these public sector agencies that can get a hold of this information and then pass it on to Congress to act on, this for future mandates and future information streams. What mechanism do you see as being effective for making that union between the private and public sector?
Well, I don't know.
State plan.
Yeah, I don't know of any. I don't think the legislation is taking on all those things at once. I mean, that would be very ambitious to do all those at once. Like, for instance, stockpiling. I don't think anyone's calling for that. At least that I'm aware of it at this moment. But my personal view is that we need to know where we're at. Now, the USGS is going to be starting something that's already scheduled 2013, but I feel that that's too long to wait. That's why I want to accelerate some of that process and inventory the strategic and critical portion of that right now, right away, in a 6-month time frame, not years from now. So I think we're all about doing this one step at a time. First, identifying where there are possible choke points. Included in that is where our own restrictive environmental policies have created artificial choke points. So I think we're taking this one step at a time and in the right order. I don't know if Mike would want to add anything to that, but yeah.
Question on this side of the room, please.
Yeah, I'd like to try to split some hairs here because I think we hear 2 different things from politicians. One is that we are dependent on China, overly dependent on China. The other thing is the need for domestic industry. And the question is, it's very nuanced because, let's face it, the rare earth space is very, very small. There are about 100 international companies that are trying to enter this space. Most of them are not American. So the question is the goal to get less dependent on China, or the goal is to develop a domestic industry? And if I have to rephrase the question is, would a handful of non-American companies, Canadians, Australians, friendly countries, filling the gap, would that accomplish the goal of what you're trying to do?
I think, although my legislation certainly calls for federal agencies to work together cooperatively in the Department of Defense to develop a plan in case there's a disruption and be able to execute that. I do think that the fundamental issue is a reliance on an unreliable trading partner, and if in fact the rest of the industrial world responds by increasing other sources, by making available other sources of supply that are reliable, then no doubt that lowers the temperature on this issue in the Congress in terms of seeking aggressive resolutions. I think the United States has problems, though, of its own making when it comes to the regulatory framework around mining in general that make it very difficult in the United States. The permitting process that's so incredibly long. I think that we've lost a lot of our skills when it comes to the processing of these rare earth metals that any industrial economy ought to have those basic capabilities. But with that said, in terms of essential supply, the fundamental problem that I see is China. And I'm really pleased that I see other industrialized countries responding, and that will create supply that very well may be available to the United States, and I think that that's positive. And in my view, again, that certainly lessens the need for an invasive policy by the Congress.
Right here. Quick for Congressman Coffman. How do you see the Pentagon's information gathering on this issue? I know you've been very involved when it comes to the Pentagon. And what more can they do to assess the vulnerabilities in defense issues?
Well, I think that the first analysis that they had, was quite frankly wrong. I mean, they were in denial that there was a problem. And I'm not sure why they chose to take that track. Maybe it was in sympathy with the administration, that they didn't want to appear that they weren't on top of everything, and they were all of a sudden blindsided by this issue. I've challenged them on that based on new information that has come out since their initial analysis, and so I think now they're coming to the realization that it's kind of flippant to come up and say that it's not a problem for us because current law allows us to cut in the front of the line. Well, then you're having an adverse impact on the economic security of the country by virtue of doing that. And so I think there's an acknowledgement now, and we'll see that in the final report as it comes out. But I believe it will reflect a concern about China and an acknowledgement that there is a problem. And I believe that they will come to the conclusion from that the Pentagon will need to be aggressively involved in terms of intervening, possibly in advance, to make sure that at least certainly the defense industrial base has the necessary resources, but not at the expense of the rest of the industrial base.
Rick Lattimore.
First, I personally don't see how you can separate our national defense or our economic defense. They are hand in hand. We can't have a strong country with a broke, strong country.
Right.
Also, and I agree that we are much better off to have Canada being a source of materials for us than China. But can we really afford to continue to allow American jobs to go to all other parts of the country just because we will not expedite if it takes 3 times longer to get a mine in operation in the United States than it does across the border in China or in Canada, can we afford to continue to allow that to happen and let U.S. jobs go to our competitors?
You put your finger right on it. We can't afford that. Just recently, now this is coal, soft rock, not hard rock mining, and its energy. It's a little off the subject here, but recently in Trinidad, Colorado, a largely rural area with a very poor economy, there's a new coal mine that is opening up because they just discovered some amazing new coal deposits. And they're going to hire, their plans are anyway, to hire 450 to 500 people at $31 or $32 an hour. And that in that part of the state is really one of the top jobs available to the average person. I mean, that is a good income for Trinidad, Colorado. So I'm happy to see that. But we have so many environmental regulations in particular that are shutting down things. The Senator Murkowski, she talked about a preemptive move to shut down a mine before it was ever even proposed because they saw it on the horizon, certain environmentalists. So it's very disturbing to me. And I don't want to see the environmental restrictions continue that are just killing our jobs. I wish this administration, it was asked whether we're doing a lot about mining regulations. It was asked earlier of the senator. We're really focusing our immediate attention on energy regulations because that is the thing that's hurting us in the short term the most because of our massive energy needs as a country. But mining has the same energy restrictions. So I just want to see a common sense environmental policy in this country. And In the House, fortunately, we are, with Republicans in the majority, we are passing some common sense solutions to restore common sense in the environmental arena. We have not seen them acted on in the Senate, though. And I hope we at least get some of these policy writers attached to some of the appropriations bills that we're now about to be passing, I hope. So we certainly won't see all of them. I'm hoping we see some of them. The ozone restriction that Lisa Jackson has just recently come out and said, okay, we'll back off on that. Unfortunately, she's only said that we'll do so, the EPA will do so until 2013. So assuming that she's back in her position after the next November election, and I'm working for a different outcome, but if she's back in power, after we'll see those ozone regulations come back full force. So it's all a huge problem, and a lot of it gets back to the politics and who's holding office.
We have time for one more question if there is. What? Dr. Hatch.
So I just want to make sure I understand. What you're saying is that if we if we deal with the issue of permitting and these restrictions, is your assumption that the miners can produce these materials at low enough prices that the other end of the supply chain is going to buy those materials instead of buying them from elsewhere? I still think that there's a disconnect in the supply chain between the mining guys and the guys who are spending the money. And I don't really know where that fits in with the permitting environment.
Well, if we take the situation, say, with the Mountain Pass mine that was shut down for a period of time because it wasn't competitive in terms of market conditions. And now it is. And quite frankly, with China's current policy, I mean, prices are going up. And so as prices go up, I think operations that may have not been competitive before may certainly be competitive now. And so it's not about, certainly we don't want to give, I'm not interested in giving subsidies to any particular industrial sector, but I do think, but we so penalize domestic production of natural resources in the United States, I think beyond what is necessary to meet environmental concerns. And so I just think that we've got to strike a balance in this country. At the end of the day, will we be competitive? I mean, I don't know. I think in any commodity, world prices, there's a lot of volatility. But at least we'll have a competitive situation versus being reliant upon China, who I think is in violation of the WTO today.
Congressman Lamborn, Congressman Coffman, thank you very much for your time and your insights.